She heard one word point, one single word that wasn't her name, and just like that, everything she had been trying so hard to believe shattered. The penthouse was so quiet, Briana could hear her own heartbeat. 42 floors above Gangnam, Seoul glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows like something out of a dream, all neon and chrome and cold. Beautiful light. Rain traced slow lines down the glass. The silk sheets were the color of midnight. And somewhere below, the city moved and breathed and didn't know that up here, a woman was lying perfectly still, her chest barely rising, her fingers curled around the edge of the bed like she was afraid to let go, afraid or already bracing for the fall. Lee Mi Jang slept beside her. Even in sleep, he took up the whole room. That was just who he was. The kind of man whose stillness commanded more attention than most men's noise. His jaw had softened slightly in the dark, the sharp angles that made boardrooms go quiet now catching nothing but pale moonlight. His left hand heavy, deliberate, the dragon tattoo coiling from his forearm to his wrist rested against Briana's hip. The twin platinum bands on his fingers glinted faintly. One for his empire. One he had placed on her hand 14 months ago in a ceremony that had felt more like a treaty signing than a wedding. She had told herself that would change. She had been telling herself that for 14 months, his breathing had gone deep and slow an hour ago. The rhythm of a man who carried the weight of Seoul's underworld across his shoulders every waking hour and finally set it down. Briana had watched the tension leave his face the way you watch a storm pass with relief, and with a quiet awareness that the damage was already done. She should have been sleeping too. She wasn't. She was watching him the way she always watched him when he couldn't watch back, searching his face for something he never let her see during the day. Some softness meant for her. Some small proof that behind the iron discipline and the empire and the dual platinum rings, there was a space she actually occupied. She was still searching when his lips parted. Sora. The word came out barely above breath. Tender. Aching. A man reaching for something in his sleep the way you reach for something you have loved so long the wanting has become involuntary. Briana stopped breathing. Her body understood before her mind caught up. Her lungs simply refused. Her fingers went cold where they rested against the mattress. The rain kept tapping the glass and the city kept glittering below, and the silk sheets felt suddenly, horribly, like something closing around her.
Sora.
The name landed the way a verdict lands, not loud, not dramatic. Just final, Sora. The woman Briana had heard whispered in careful, clipped tones at Seoul's high society dinners before someone always changed the subject. The woman from the kind of family whose name was carved into this city the way Mi Jang's was through money, through blood, through arrangements made long before either of them had a say. The woman who had disappeared 4 years ago, weeks before their arranged marriage could be finalized. The woman the city said Lee Mi Jang had loved to the edge of reason. Briana had never asked him directly. She had been afraid of what his silence would confirm. Now she knew. He shifted beside her. His hand tightened against her hip, and that was the part that broke something clean in two. That grip. That closeness. Because in 14 months of marriage, Mi Jang had never once held her like she was something he was afraid to lose. He had been present, always.
Correct.
Never cruel. But his hands had always carried the same controlled distance as the rest of him, except right now. In the dark, reaching for a ghost, he was holding on. He whispered the name again, lower this time, like a secret his body refused to keep. A cold, clarifying truth settled over Briana Carlos like water filling a room. Not slowly. All at once. She had never been his wife. She had been the transaction that came after Sora. The American tech heiress her father had offered, and that Mi Jang had accepted, when the right alliance required a name attached to a ring. She had been the placeholder. The living stand-in for a woman who had walked away before the deal could close. She had known this, technically, from the beginning. She had just not known it the way she knew it now, with his voice still warm in the air between them, carrying someone else's name like a prayer. Briana did not cry. She did not wake him. She did not say a word. She lay there for a few more minutes, very still, committing the feeling to memory the way you memorize the details of a place you know you will never see again. The weight of his hand, the sound of his breathing, the way Seoul looked at this hour when it had no idea what it was witnessing. Then she got up. She moved through the penthouse the way she had learned to move through his world, quietly, precisely, disturbing nothing. Her closet emptied in under 20 minutes. Her perfume bottles gone from the bathroom counter. Every small evidence of Briana Carlos removed. She was methodical about it. The way you are when you have already made the decision and there is nothing left to do but execute it cleanly. She paused once, at the mahogany nightstand. The platinum wedding ring was heavy in her palm. Heavier than it should have been for something so small. She set it down. Not thrown, placed. Directly in the center, exactly where his eyes would open. She made sure it caught the light. She left no note. Some betrayals are too big for paper. And some goodbyes, the ones where you have to leave while the person is still sleeping, while their hand is still warm from touching you, some of those are better said in objects than in words. By the time the first gray light began pressing at the edges of the Seoul skyline, the space beside Lee Mi Jang was cold. Briana Carlos was already crossing the Pacific Point 2 years later. Los Angeles, California. The shop smelled like linseed oil and old wood and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in rooms where people do patient, careful work. Briana didn't look up when the door opened. She was bent over a 19th century oil painting laid flat beneath her magnifying lamp, a fine brush in her right hand, her left arm braced against the table with the controlled ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Her natural hair was pulled back from her face, a few loose coils escaping at her temples where the afternoon light caught them and turned them gold. She wore a worn denim apron over a simple white shirt, the apron stained in places with the evidence of months of work, pale smears of solvent near the chest pocket, a shadow of burnt umber along the left seam, a fingerprint of cadmium yellow she had never quite gotten out. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had built something real, in a city that didn't know her history, with her own two steady hands. The art restoration boutique on the edge of downtown Los Angeles was hers entirely. Small, deliberately quiet, known in the right circles for the kind of meticulous, unhurried work that museums called about when they had something fragile and irreplaceable. Briana had built the reputation herself, one repaired canvas at a time, one damaged manuscript at a time. She had arrived in this city with 3 suitcases, a name no one here could connect to Seoul, and a talent for fixing the things other people had given up on. She had found a rhythm. She had found peace, or something close enough that the difference had stopped mattering most days. IT was not a small thing, what she had built. She knew that. She had pressed her hands into the work of it deliberately, the early mornings, the difficult clients, the months when the studio barely broke even and she had eaten simply and slept without complaint and told herself that every cracked thing she repaired was practice for something she couldn't yet name. She had become someone in the city. Someone quiet, yes. Someone careful. But someone whose hands were steady and whose name meant something and who had learned, at some cost, that she did not need to be chosen by someone else to be real. She had chosen herself. That had been enough. "We close in 10 minutes, she said, her voice smooth, her eyes still on the painting. The silence that followed was one beat too long. The kind of silence that has a shape to it. A weight. The kind your body registers before your mind gives it a name. You didn't answer my calls for 730 days, Briana." The voice was low, controlled, carrying that particular, quiet authority that didn't need volume to fill a room that had never needed volume. "I don't think 10 minutes will suffice." The brush slipped from her fingers. She caught it before it hit the canvas, muscle memory, the trained reflex of someone who had spent years learning never to let things fall, but the rest of her had already gone somewhere else entirely. Her spine locked. Her chest tightened around a breath she couldn't finish taking. Every careful, constructed calm she had assembled over 730 days contracted to a single point, that voice. She had spent exactly those 730 days he had apparently been counting, which meant something she refused to examine right now, learning how not to hear it in her sleep. learning how to move through an entire afternoon without her mind drifting back to the particular low register of it, the way it had once said her name in the dark. And there it was. In her studio. In her city. Standing in the doorway of the life she had built specifically to be free of it, filling the sunlit room like it had always belonged there. Don't turn around. Some part of her said, don't give him the moment of seeing your face before you're ready. But her hands had already gone still on the work table. And her body had already made the decision her mind was still arguing about. She turned. Lee Mi Jang stood in the doorway of her studio. He wore a black wool overcoat over a charcoal turtleneck, no tie, no visible marker of the kind of wealth that had always moved quietly around him like gravity. Simple. And completely impossible to mistake for anything other than what he was, a man who commanded without needing to perform it.
He looked the same.
And he looked different. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she remembered, carved in by something she hadn't been present for. The set of his jaw was harder. He looked like a man who had spent 2 years doing something that cost him daily and had not once allowed himself to stop. The twin platinum rings still sat on his fingers. Both of them. The Empire Band and the one she had placed on that nightstand in Gangnam, like a period at the end of a sentence. He had kept it. He was wearing it. She filed that away and refused to let herself feel it yet. His eyes moved over her the way they always had, slowly, completely, cataloging every change with an attention so total it had once made her feel profoundly seen, and now made her feel like something being assessed for structural damage. The cropped natural hair, the denim apron, the absence of any jewelry on her left hand. He took all of it in without expression, the controlled mask giving nothing away, the same mask she had spent 14 months trying to find the seam of. She had never found the seam. How did you find me? Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. I never stopped looking. He stepped forward just one step, measured and deliberate, the step of a man who understood precisely what territory he did not have the right to occupy but was choosing to acknowledge the edge of. The platinum rings caught the California sun streaming through her studio windows. You vanished without explanation. You left a ring on a table and expected me to accept silence as a divorce decree. The steadiness cracked. Not dramatically. Briana Carlos did not come apart dramatically, had never in her life made the easy theater of falling apart where someone could see her do it. But something beneath her ribs moved. Something that had been compressed and sealed and stacked in a careful, livable shape for 2 years shifted, and when she spoke again, 2 years of maintained composure were in her voice, like a fault line finally showing itself at the surface. You called her name. The words were quiet. They were not quiet because she was calm. In the bed we shared. You whispered Sora's name with a tenderness you never once directed at me. You pulled me closer in your sleep because you were reaching for her. Her dark eyes held his without flinching. I will not be a ghost substitute. I will not hold a space in your life that was always meant for someone else. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger. Something older than anger and more complicated. Something that had been living in him for a long time and had not yet found the right container. He held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence between them exist without trying to fill it. Then he took another step forward, closing enough of the distance between them that she could smell him sandalwood, cold air, the particular clean edge of a man who traveled light and carried nothing decorative, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something dangerous and deliberate and stripped entirely of performance. Is that what you believe? He let the question sit between them like something placed rather than asked. That I loved her? Briana said nothing. You know nothing of what happened in Seoul, Briana. His jaw tightened once, the only fracture in the surface of him. I wasn't dreaming of Sora, out of longing. He held her gaze and did not look away. I was dreaming of burying her. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Outside, Los Angeles continued without them, traffic and voices and the indifferent, golden indifference of a city that had seen everything and remembered nothing. Inside the studio, the painting under the magnifying lamp waited with the patience of something that had already survived more than a century of damage. Briana stood in the middle of it all. Her heart was doing something it had no business doing. Her hands were still, she kept them still, but the rest of her was moving in ways she couldn't yet name, toward a truth she hadn't been prepared to receive and didn't yet know what to do with. She looked at this man in her doorway. She looked at the rings on his fingers. Both of them, and she said nothing, because some things need a moment to be real before they can be spoken. The words didn't land softly. They weren't meant, I was dreaming of burying her. Briana stood in the middle of her studio, the California sun warm across her shoulders, her heart doing something violent and private behind her ribs, and she looked at this man, this controlled, impossible, infuriating man, and she tried to find the lie in his face. She didn't find one. That was almost worse. Lee Mi Jang held her gaze with the same unblinking steadiness that had always made her feel like he could read her thoughts before she finished having them. He hadn't moved again. He had stopped at a distance that was deliberately close, but not close enough, the distance of a man who knew exactly how much space he was taking up and had chosen it with the precision of someone who calculated everything. The dragon tattoo on his forearm disappeared under the pushed-back edge of his sleeve. The twin platinum rings caught the light. Both of them. Still there. Still his. She should tell him to leave. She had told him to leave. 2 years ago, she had said it in the clearest language available, no words at all, just a ring on a nightstand and an empty closet, and he had apparently decided that wasn't clear enough. And here he stood in her Los Angeles studio, in her rebuilt life, with that voice and that jaw, and that scent that her body still recognized before her mind could object to it. Dreaming of burying her, Briana repeated. Her own voice surprised her, quiet, level. No tremor in it. Her hands were still. She was grateful for that. That's what you want me to believe. That's what I'm telling you happened. He said it the way he said everything, with the kind of absolute certainty that had once made her feel anchored. Now it only reminded her of how little she had ever actually known about the man she had married. My investigators confirmed Sora was alive the night you left, operating from American soil, tracking your location. Something moved through Briana's chest, something cold and sharp-edged. She had been feeding my shipping routes to a rival syndicate, Mi Jang continued, his voice dropping lower, each word measured and careful, like a man disarming something as he spoke. A man called Chief Jean. The turf war that nearly dismantled my family's hold on 3 ports 2 years ago, that was her work. Coordinated. Systematic. She had been inside my operations for 18 months before I found the seams. He paused. The night you heard her name, I had just received the confirmation report. I had spent hours rereading it. Her name was the last thing in my mind before sleep took me. Briana was quiet for a long time. Outside, Los Angeles moved on indifferently, traffic, voices, the distant percussion of someone's music carried up from the street below. Her studio hummed with the familiar smell of linseed oil. The painting under the magnifying lamp waited patiently, its cracked canvas asking for nothing. She had spent 2 years restoring broken things. She knew how to recognize damage. And she also knew, with the precision of someone who had studied destruction professionally, when something had been broken deliberately, when the cracking was not age or accident, but the practiced work of someone who had located the fault lines in advance. You're telling me, she said slowly, that I left a marriage, crossed an ocean, and rebuilt my entire life from zero because of a confirmation report you were reading in your sleep. He said nothing, which was somehow its own kind of answer. You should have told me. The words came out with an edge she hadn't planned for, clean and unsparing as a restoration scalpel finding the seam between original paint and damage. When you found out she was alive. When you found out she was tracking me. You should have told me, Mi Jang. I was your wife, not a chess piece you protect by keeping ignorant. I know that. The admission moved across his face like something being peeled slowly back. For just a moment, just one, the mask didn't slip so much as pause, and what she saw in that pause was not cold authority or calculated stillness. It was something raw, something that had been carrying its weight alone for 2 years without once setting it down. His jaw tightened. He looked away, toward her studio windows, toward the city that wasn't his and didn't know him. "I know that," he said again, quieter. "And I've been sitting with that knowledge every single day since you left." The silence between them stretched. Briana felt the pull of it, that gravitational thing that had always existed between her and this man, that impossible, inconvenient, infuriating pull, and she pressed her palms flat against the work table behind her. The wood grain pressed into her skin. It kept her grounded. It kept her here, in the present, in the body of someone who had survived him once and needed to remember that clearly. "Dinner," he said finally, turning back to her. "One conversation. You can walk out the door after, and I won't follow." She looked at him carefully. "That's not a promise a man in your position makes lightly," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Briana looked down at the painting under her lamp. The 19th century oil, a woman standing at a window, facing away, her expression unreadable from behind. She had been working on it for 3 weeks. Patient, careful, undoing someone else's damage one brushstroke at a time. She looked back at Mi Jang.
"I'll meet you," she said.
"I'm not getting in your car." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Mi Jang didn't smile easily, and she had never trusted it when he did, but something adjacent. Something that looked, briefly, like relief that had been waiting a long time for a door to open. He left the way he came.
"No entourage, no spectacle."
Just the quiet click of the door behind him and the scent of sandalwood fading slowly from the air of a room that suddenly felt both larger and emptier than it had before he stepped into it. Briana stood alone for a long moment after he was gone. Then she pressed her hand to her chest, felt her heart doing exactly what she would have preferred it not to, and said absolutely nothing to the room. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to be real. The restaurant sat at the edge of the Pacific like a secret, private. No sign visible from the road. The kind of place that existed only for people who moved in circles careful enough to know its address without being told twice. Briana arrived 10 minutes after the agreed time, not late enough to be rude, not early enough to be eager. She had changed out of the denim apron into a dress the color of deep water, something fitted and unhurried, the fabric moving against her brown skin with the quiet ease of something chosen for herself and no one else. Her natural hair was loose now, a soft dark crown framing her face, the small silver hoops in her ears catching the last light of the evening as she walked in. She had left his ring in a drawer in Los Angeles. She would leave it there. Mi Jang was already seated. He rose when she entered. The gesture stopped her mid-step. He had never stood for her before. In Seoul, he had been always present and always slightly unreachable, a skyline you could orient yourself by, but never actually touch. Here he stood, for her, in a restaurant where no one was watching, and he had nothing to perform. Like it cost him something measurable, and he was paying it without negotiation. She sat across from him and told herself it didn't matter. The Pacific stretched beyond the window like the world had simply forgotten to have a far edge. Candles between them threw warm, unsteady light across the sharp planes of his face. He looked exhausted in a way the polished surface of him almost concealed. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she remembered. The set of his shoulders carried a weight that 14 months of marriage had not yet put there. "You look like you haven't slept since Seoul," she said. "I haven't slept well since Seoul," he said. And then, with the flat, undecorated honesty that had always been the most disarming thing about him, "Since the morning I woke up and found the ring." She said nothing to that. He told her everything over the next hour. Slowly. The way you take apart something dangerous without rushing, making sure each piece was visible before reaching for the next.
Sora.
Chief Jean. The 18 months of coordinated betrayal. The shipping manifests. The port wars. 3 men dead in a conflict Sora had engineered from inside Mi Jang's own infrastructure while presenting herself to Seoul's society as the woman he had discarded. She positioned herself as the wound, he said, his voice flat and controlled. The heartbroken ex-fiancée. Every dinner party had a version of the story the woman Lee Mi Jang had walked away from before the arrangement could be finalized. She used that story like a passkey. It gave her access to the people closest to me. And for 18 months, she bled us from the inside. His jaw tightened. The confirmation came the night before you left. I spent hours reading through the evidence. Her name was the last thing I processed before I fell asleep. Briana looked at him across the candlelight. And you didn't tell me, she said. I needed to verify the full scope before I put it in front of you. He met her gaze and held it. Once you knew what was moving in the dark around us, there was no taking it back. I wanted 48 hours to be certain. A pause. I thought I had time. You didn't.
No.
The silence that passed between them had the specific texture of 2 years compressed into a single breath. Then Mi Jang reached across the table. Not to take her hand, he didn't presume that. He gripped her knuckles with a firmness that was entirely, unmistakably protective, and she felt the heat of it run straight up her arm and settle somewhere behind her sternum before she could decide whether she wanted it there. Running made you a target, he said. Sora's people had been tracking you for months. That's why tonight, the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows exploded inward, not the sound of breaking glass. Something deeper, more violent, a concussive pressure wave that sent the nearest tables sideways and killed every candle in a single breath. Briana was on her feet before she understood the command her body was following, instinct pulling her upright even as her mind was still translating the sound into meaning. Mi Jang was already moving a different kind of movement, one that stripped away every layer of dinner and overcoats and controlled reserve and showed exactly what lived underneath all of that. A man who had been built for precisely this, his security detail engaged. The restaurant became something else entirely. Then the flashbang detonated, white, absolute, blinding, and then nothing at all. When the smoke began to thin, Mi Jang was standing with blood darkening the shoulder of his overcoat a graze, treated as minor, his jaw set and his eyes moving through the room with a cold, systematic focus that belonged to no dinner table anywhere. His hands were steady. His expression had the specific blankness of a man running tree-off on a situation and filing human costs somewhere he would deal with later. He turned. The chair beside him was empty. Briana was gone. She came back to herself in pieces. The smell, first industrial rust, salt water, the deep cold of concrete that had never been meant for human comfort. Then the overhead light, a single harsh beam that turned everything outside its radius into pure dark and made everything inside it feel like an interrogation room in someone's bad dream. Then the chair beneath her, the zip ties biting into her wrists, the vast shadow of the warehouse pressing in from all sides like something that had learned to be patient. The cage. She had heard that name in the periphery, while whatever they had used on her was still wearing off. She filed it. She filed the corroded ceiling 20 feet up, the derelict assembly lines dissolving into shadow beyond the light's reach, the smell of salt water and diesel threading under the rust the port. Los Angeles. They hadn't taken her far. She filed all of it the way she had always filed difficult things, calmly, precisely, without the luxury of panic. Briana rolled her shoulders once against the restraints. Testing, not fighting. Firm. Applied by someone practiced. She stopped testing before it looked like testing. 14 months inside Mi Jang's world had taught her many things she had hoped never to need, and one of them was that you didn't telegraph your thinking to a room full of people whose profession was reading it. She went still. She waited. She assessed. Sora stepped out of the shadow. Briana had seen photographs. Seoul's high society circulated images with the careful selectivity of people who understood that visibility was a form of currency, and Sora had always been visible in precisely the right measure, always at the deliberate edge of frames, always poised with the specific studied ease of someone who had rehearsed effortlessness until it looked like nature. The woman who walked into the light now wore that composure like something that had been stretched past its yield point. Still beautiful, the architectural, severe kind of beauty that photographs well and unsettles people in person, but there was something in her eyes that no photograph had captured. Something bitter and concentrated, the look of a person who had been running on grievance for so long it had become the only fuel they recognized. Chief Jean stood at her left, broad, cold-eyed, The kind of man whose longevity in a violent business said everything about his capacity for calculation. Armed men occupied the shadows at his back like furniture. Sora looked at Briana the way you look at evidence you've already decided the meaning of. He gave up an empire's alliance for this, she said. Her English was flawless and weaponized. Her eyes moved from Briana's face to her bound wrists and back again, slow and contemptuous. Sentiment. Such a predictable weakness in otherwise intelligent men. Briana looked back at her.
Steady.
Unimpressed in a way that was entirely genuine and required no performance. You coordinated an international kidnapping to tell me I'm not your type, Briana said. I'm genuinely moved by the effort. Something shifted in Sora's face. Not quite anger, something less stable than anger, something that had been held under pressure for too long. Mi Jang signs over the asset codes, Sora said, her voice returning to flat and controlled. Each word a piece moved on a board. Every port account, every holding, every family asset. Chief Jean takes Seoul operations. I get what was promised to me 4 years ago, before your presence complicated the arrangement. She reached into her coat. The gun she pressed to Briana's temple was cold enough to feel through her hair. All you have to do is be here when he arrives. For him to walk through that door, Briana said. He always comes for you. Sora said it with the clinical precision of a diagnosis. Like love was a condition you contracted and eventually died from. I've known that since before you existed in his life. It's the one consistent thing about him. Briana absorbed this without expression, underneath the table of fear, and the fear was real. She didn't pretend otherwise. She was not a woman who confused composure with the absence of feeling there was something else. Something that had been sharpening in the back of her mind since she came back to herself in this chair. Her left hand pressed almost imperceptibly against the edge of the apron she still wore, the restoration tool. Small, metal, precisely edged. The kind of implement you kept in your pocket out of pure professional habit because your hands were always working, always finding the angle that opened with enough patience. She began, not quickly, not visibly, 1 millimeter at a time, in the dark beneath the chair, with absolute faith that patience would open what force never could. She was still working when the warehouse doors came apart. He came through the dark without ceremony. There was nothing theatrical about the way Lee Mi Jang entered a room that had been built to contain him. He moved with the same controlled, predatory economy that governed everything he did. No wasted energy, no performance. Nothing expended that wasn't strictly necessary. His security detail flowed in on both sides. His left shoulder held its careful angle, the wound beneath the bandage treated as a variable he had already accounted for and deprioritized. His eyes moved once through the warehouse, mapping it in the time it took most people to blink, and then they found her, across the industrial dark, across the harsh overhead beam, across the gun at her temple and the chains and Chief Jean rising from the floor, and Sora's expression of cold victory. His eyes found Briana and stayed there. The room seemed to contract around that single exchange, not violently, not dramatically, but with the irreversible physics of a decision being made. Something moved through his face. Something that had nothing to do with port operations or asset codes or the 10 armed men fanned into the shadows behind Chief Jean. Something entirely, nakedly personal that he did not attempt to conceal and did not seem to care about concealing. Then it was gone. Back behind the control. Back behind the underboss. Sora. His voice reached every corner of the warehouse without effort or volume. Step back from my wife. Your wife. Sora turned the phrase over with the deliberate slowness of someone finding a flaw in a structure. The gun at Briana's temple did not move.
Still.
After everything she put you through. Her head tilted, a movement of pure calculation. You came all this way for her, Mi Jang. That tells me everything I need to know about who holds the leverage in this room. My leverage, Mi Jang said quietly, is not in this room. He was buying time. Briana understood it immediately, the measured pace of each word, the way he held position without advancing, the slight angle of his body that gave nothing away while his eyes did the real work. He was waiting for something to shift. She decided to give him what he needed. Chief Jean moved first, not toward Mi Jang, toward Briana, the calculation obvious. She was the pivot, and controlling the pivot controlled the board. He was a large man, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had made this particular calculation correctly many times before. He had not calculated Briana Carlos. Her wrists came free with a single clean sound, the zip tie finally giving way in exactly the place she had been working for the last several minutes. She was upright before Chief Jean had covered half the distance. The heavy wooden chair came around on pure momentum, all of her body weight behind it, and it connected with both his knees with a sound that was definitive and final. Chief Jean dropped onto the concrete and stayed there. Sora spun. The gun swept toward Briana, and Mi Jang fired first .1 shot.
Clean.
Precise. The weapon spun from Sora's hand and skidded across the warehouse floor, and Sora stumbled backward with a sound that was more rage than pain, the disarm exact enough that she was uninjured, and total enough that she was entirely, permanently out of the conversation. Mi Jang's security moved. The warehouse filled with the brief, controlled sounds of trained men overwhelming an ambush that had already lost its architecture, and then quickly, completely, it was over. Silence returned. Different from every silence that had preceded it in this story. Not cold. Not suffocating. Not the silence of a Gangnam penthouse running out of warmth or a Los Angeles studio suddenly airless with the weight of someone's return. This was the silence of something finished. The silence after the last complicated note of a long piece finally resolves to its root. Chief Jean was secured. Sora was in restraints, her composure entirely gone, replaced by something more honest and considerably less dangerous. The shadows had been cleared. Mi Jang walked toward Briana, slowly, like a man who had been operating at absolute capacity for an extended period and was only now, in the quiet, allowing himself to register what it cost. His left shoulder compensated. His tailored overcoat bore the evidence of the night ash, the dark mark of the wound, the particular dishevelment of expensive clothing that has been through something it wasn't designed for. His face, as he crossed the warehouse floor toward her, was something she had never seen on it in 14 months of marriage and 2 years of aftermath. Unguarded. Not soft, that wasn't the word for it. Unguarded. As though everything he typically used to manage his expression had simply been set down, and what remained was only what was actually there. A man who had crossed an ocean, taken a bullet's graze, breached an industrial warehouse with a shoulder wound, and was now standing 2 feet from a woman he had come for with trembling hands and nothing left to pretend with. He stopped inches from her. His breathing was controlled, but not easy. He looked at her the way you look at something you have spent a long time afraid of losing. "You cut through the zip tie," he said. "I'm a restorer," she said. "I always carry the right tool." He exhaled. It came out of him like something he had been holding for 2 years, long and slow, and releasing something that had been compressed too long in too small a space. Then he reached into his vest pocket and took out the ring. Brianna's breath went still. The platinum band caught the harsh overhead light the same way it had caught Seoul moonlight, the same way it had caught California sun in her studio doorway, the small, permanent object that had been carrying the weight of everything she had set down and everything he had refused to. He had been carrying it against his chest. Through every calculated move and every sleepless night and every port war and every 2 a.m. confirmation report in a Gangnam penthouse that had gone cold on one side. He did not slide it onto her finger. He did not assume. He went down on one knee on the gritty concrete floor of the warehouse. Lee Mi Jang, underboss, the man who commanded Seoul's most powerful syndicate with a word. Kneeling on the floor of a place called the Cage, in a blood-stained overcoat, surrounded by the wreckage of a war he had just won, with trembling hands and dark eyes stripped entirely of strategy, holding up a ring he had carried for 730 days and never once put away. He looked up at her. "I don't want what we were," he said. His voice was rough with everything it was trying to hold. The alliance, the transaction, the arrangement wearing a ring. He paused, and the pause cost him something she could see clearly. I want to earn you. From the beginning. Every day, from nothing assumed and nothing owed. Let me court you properly, Briana. Let me prove every single day, for as long as it takes, that you are the only name I will ever carry into the dark. She looked at the ring for a long time. The warehouse was quiet around them. Somewhere behind her, Sora's chains shifted against concrete. Chief Jean had not moved. The world that had tried to use Briana Carlos as a bargaining chip had been taken apart with professional efficiency, and now there was nothing left in this space except 2 people and 2 years and a platinum band resting in a trembling hand on the floor of a building called the Cage. Briana looked at Mi Jang's face. She looked at him, and she let herself actually look, without the filter of anger or self-protection or the careful management of hope that had kept her functional for 2 years. She thought about Seoul, the cold silk sheets and the rain on the glass and the weight of his hand on her hip and another woman's name carried on his breath like something sacred. She thought about the dawn crossing, the 3 suitcases, the studio built one painting at a time. She thought about the ring she had placed on that nightstand with such care, not thrown, placed, because even in the worst moment of her life, she had not been careless with things that mattered. She thought about what it meant that he had carried it, not kept it in a drawer, not stored it in a safe somewhere in the Gangnam penthouse as a piece of unfinished business. Carried it on his body,
against his chest.
every day for 730 days, through every port war and every sleepless night and every hour of this particular evening that had almost ended very differently. She reached down and took the ring from his palm, not to put it on. Not yet. She closed her fingers around it and felt its weight exactly the same as it had always been, and entirely different from everything she remembered, and she looked at Lee Mi Jang still on one knee on the floor and felt something move in the architecture of her chest. Not collapse. Not surrender. The specific, irreversible movement of a door that has been closed for a long time beginning to open. Get up, she said quietly. He rose. Slowly. His eyes did not leave hers. She turned the ring once between her fingers. The platinum caught the overhead light. 2 years of weight in something small enough to close a fist around. I need dinner first, Briana said. Her voice was steady. There was something else in it too, something that had been sealed away for 2 years and was now cautiously testing the air. Not a strategy dinner. Not a debrief. Actual dinner. Where you ask me what I want, and you let me finish answering before you've already decided. She held his gaze. And then we start there. One day at a time. Nothing assumed. Nothing owed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but closer than she had ever seen it get, without effort, without performance, without it being in service of something else. One day at a time, he repeated. Like he was testing the weight of something he had not been allowed to carry before. Take me somewhere that doesn't know your name, Mi Jang. The rest we figure out as we go. He reached for her hand. Slowly telegraphing the movement the way you extend an offering to something that has been frightened before, giving her every opportunity to step back. She didn't step back. His fingers closed around hers.
Warm.
Deliberate. Present in a way that had nothing to do with transactions or arrangements or the gravitational pull of an empire that needed an alliance attached to it. Just his hand around hers, in a warehouse that smelled like rust and salt water, at the far end of the longest night either of them had ever been asked to survive. They walked out into the Los Angeles dark together. The city sprawled ahead of them, lights and noise and the relentless, beautiful indifference of a place that had seen everything and judged nothing. The Pacific was somewhere to the west. Mi Jang's convoy waited at the perimeter, his security falling into quiet formation without being asked, the machinery of his world operating around them like weather that had learned long ago not to require his attention. Briana looked up. A handful of stars had held on above the light pollution. Not many. Enough. The ring was still in her left hand. Still not on her finger. Still waiting, patient, as everything worth waiting for always is. She wasn't ready to put it on. She might not be ready for weeks or months, and she understood now in a way that 26-year-old Briana arriving in Seoul with something to prove had not yet understood that readiness was not something you performed on someone else's schedule. She was a restorer. She knew this better than she knew almost anything. The most irreplaceable things required the most patience. You didn't rush a cracked canvas. You worked in the light that made damage visible, and you moved slowly, and you did not mistake the pace of the work for a lack of conviction. She understood what she was holding. She understood what it meant that he had carried it. Mi Jang opened the door of the waiting car for her. She paused before getting in, looking back once at the warehouse, the industrial gray of it, the rust streaks on the walls, the single overhead light still burning through the high windows like something that had forgotten to go out. The cage. The place someone had brought her to reduce her to leverage, and she had cut her own way free. She turned away from it, got in the car. Mi Jang settled beside her close but not pressing, his wounded shoulder careful in its angle, his right hand resting near hers with the particular deliberateness of a man who had learned, at some cost, the difference between proximity and possession. The convoy moved through the Los Angeles night. Streetlights dragged across the windows in slow amber lines. "There's a place," he said after a while. "In Silver Lake. Korean.
Small.
The owner has no idea who I am." "Good," Briana said. "The Hamelpagian is. Don't tell me." She turned to look at him in the amber light. His face was sharp and tired, and, beneath both of those things, wearing something she had never seen clearly on it before, hope that had not yet learned to disguise itself as something more controlled. "Let me taste it myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Softly, she looked forward again. The ring was still in her palm. The city kept moving the way cities do, indifferent to individual disasters, indifferent to individual recoveries, equally unmoved by both. Outside the window, Los Angeles glittered the way Seoul had glittered across a different window in a different life. But she was not the woman who had lain in those silk sheets, searching a sleeping man's face for proof that she existed to him. She was Briana Carlos. She had crossed an ocean with 3 suitcases and built something from nothing. She had repaired what other people had given up on and learned the particular patience that irreplaceable things require and cut through her own restraints in the dark using tools she had always carried. She had placed a ring on a nightstand with care and survived the placing. She had come back on her own terms, not because the world had run out of other options for her, but because she had looked at the truth in full and decided it was worth walking toward. The ring in her hand was not yet on her finger, but she had not let go of it, either point one day at a time. She had said it and meant it. And in the quiet of the car, with the city sliding past and the man beside her sitting with her in the silence instead of filling it with strategy for once, simply sitting, she let herself believe it. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever loved someone fully and still not been enough for them, or believed that about yourself when the truth was something else, entirely share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, did Mi Jang deserve her forgiveness, or should that ring have stayed in her hand forever?